There are a number of difficulties that we run into if we define reason as science straight up, or if we try to say that a belief is rational only in the case that it is scientifically justified. Okay, there are a number of problems we run into. The first problem that one runs into if you hold this kind of view, that only scientifically justified statements are rational, the first problem is self-contradiction. You have to ask about that very claim itself. Is it scientifically justified? Where are the experiments that show it? Where is the scientific theory from which you can deduce it? It's a very old philosophical point that goes a long ways back in the history of philosophy, that certain propositions that contradict themselves, and a hard kind of scientistic view of reason tends to be self-contradictory. If you say I will not believe anything, or nothing should be believed unless it can be scientifically justified, you have to ask, well, should I believe that very claim itself? How do you scientifically justify that? Okay, so there's the first problem with it. The second problem is that, as we know from studying science, that scientists do not justify or give arguments for normative propositions, statements about what ought to be done or what should be done. Okay? So if you think that reason is the same as science, and that only those statements that are scientifically justified are rational, you immediately have to, or almost immediately, draw the conclusion that no moral proposition, no normative statement about what should or shouldn't be done, thou shalt not kill, for example, that doesn't count as a rational proposition. It's not a deliverance of reason. And that's where a lot of people in our society are now. They're fed from a very early age this view that reason is the same as science, and alongside of it, by implication, they hold that moral claims cannot be a matter of reason and reasoning and thinking and intelligent reflection and truth and falsity or inference. They have to be something else. They're a matter of sentiment or a matter of opinion or a matter of one's private views or preference or whatever. Now, philosophers in the universities generally don't go in for that kind of view. They're not non-cognitivists. But on the streets, so to speak, for people who haven't studied a lot of philosophy, that's just where a lot of people are. And so you've experienced this in your workplaces, I'm sure, when you try to have moral conversations with people. It's just not a matter of reasoning. I mean, before the conversation even gets started, any kind of moral debate or moral argument about what ought to be done or how we ought to live or what kind of laws ought to be passed or whatever is just not the kind of thing that can be settled by reason. It's just not a candidate for rational discourse. Because basically, if you ask them, well, what do you mean by reason? Well, it's science. And of course, biologists don't make normative propositions, and chemists don't make normative propositions. So, okay, so moral discourse is out. And that's where a lot of people are. Also, more fundamental things are out too. So if you start to ask about the meaning of life, like what is the meaning of life? What's the ultimate point of life? It's a perfectly intelligible question. And philosophers have dealt with it for many, many centuries. But scientists as such, chemists, physicists, biologists, don't answer it, don't try to answer it, and can't answer it on the basis of their own methods. So what you also run into, if you identify reason and science, is the view that any kind of account of the ultimate end of human life, of the purpose of life, or the meaning of life, that too does not count as a matter of reason. That's not susceptible to rational discussion, rational discovery, rational debate, or rational reflection. So really all there are personal projects. You have your understanding of what the meaning of your life is, and you have your understanding of what the meaning of life is. But objectively, there's no such thing as the meaning of life for everybody, or at least not one that we can settle. And that's where a lot of people are too. It's a nihilist position, okay, that really ultimately there is no ultimate meaning of life, at least not one for everybody, no objective one. And it's not a matter of truth and falsity, claims about the meaning of life or the ultimate purpose of life. So if you go in and say that reason is the same as science, if one goes in for that view, you're going to end up, if you don't think about it very carefully, with a kind of moral relativism or a certain view, a despair about the rationality of moral language and moral discourse. You're going to end up in despair about the meaning of life, about, or at least the objective, the objective reality to there being a meaning of life. And you're going to end up very confused and self-contradictory, in a self-contradictory kind of position. So basically, that view, that reason is the same as science, which is sort of the default position, is not one that's worth going in for. It has all kinds of problems. Here's another problem with it. If that's true, if reason is the same as science, then no one before the 16th century was really rational, okay? Because science itself comes into being in the 16th century. At least science as the term is used today, okay? And as I'm using it here. So we would have to say someone like Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, all of these people weren't rational. Why? Because, well, they didn't justify very many things on the basis of experimentation, controlled experiments, etc. So, yeah, that's not the kind of thing we need to buy. There is, according to both philosophers and the church, who has tended to preserve a more ancient form of philosophy, there is a much broader, richer conception of reason that is perfectly legitimate, on the table, and there for us to think in terms of. That we can say that reason is not the same as science. What is reason, according to this older, more ancient, and frankly, I think much more sophisticated view? Reason is the receptivity of the human intellect to the whole of reality. The whole of reality. The visible and the invisible. The quantifiable and the non-quantifiable. The material and the immaterial. The tangible and the intangible. If there are such things as non-quantifiable, non-tangible realities. Okay? Reason, at least of itself, is open towards this, is capable of receiving these realities and coming into contact with them. And so goodness, for example, or happiness, or the meaning of life, falls within the range of reason. Reason can reflect upon these kinds of questions, these topics, and can think about them. And in fact, there's a very long and esteemed history of people doing just that. Talking about the meaning of life, talking about what is good, what will make us happy, what virtue is, what law is, how human life ought to be lived together in society, and it was a matter of rational discourse and truth. And that tradition extends all the way to our own founding fathers of the United States, who thought about the moral life, the political life, the meaning of life, the organization of society as something that we can rationally discuss without necessarily appealing to science at every step of the way. Okay? So that's a much broader conception of reason. And on that view of reason, we could call it a reason as wisdom-seeking or as sapiential, not scientific, but sapiential. Reason is capable of doing quite a bit. And the church has actually defined in her teachings that reason is capable of grasping or showing, demonstrating that God exists. And reason is capable of grasping or demonstrating the immateriality of the human soul and the immortality of the human person.